programs wanted to be involved in co-sponsoring this event. Our colleagues in the Brazil Institute, the Asia Institute, the China Environment Forum. It, I think, is a reflection of her and her wonderful presence at the center, and it also reflects the breadth of her work. There aren't too many researchers of her ambition who would have been able to reach out and combine these cases and conduct the field work that she's conducted in quite the same way. And I think as you take a look at her biography, and we have the biographies in a handout outside, you'll see that she has a really remarkable trajectory. She graduated with her bachelor's degree in international relations at Beijing University, and she went on and earned a master's and a PhD in politics at Princeton, and she's now in the faculty at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I think you'll have no doubt by the time you're done why she has all these accomplishments to her name. I think another sign of the importance of the subject and of her work are the people who have agreed to be the discussants today. We have Adam Auerbach, who's come all the way from American University. Michael Donovan at the IDB, who probably could walk here.
Yeah, 2 blocks away.
And Victor Vergara, who's at the World Bank. And Richard Stren. I think many of us who have been in this business for a long time know Richard. Richard actually got up at 4:30 in the morning and got on an airplane and crossed international borders to be here with us. And I think that this is all a testament to Yue and her wonderful work. What we're going to do is she's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation among the discussants, and then we'll open it up.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Blair, for such a nice, warm introduction, and thank you all for coming. So, like Blair mentioned, this is my last hooray at the Wilson Center as a fellow here. So I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Wilson Center, especially my wonderful colleagues at the Urban Sustainability Laboratory, the Brazil Institute, Asian Program, and China Environmental Forum for offering the constant support over the year. And also I'd like to thank all of you whom I have met, either at the Wilson Center or from outside the center, for being wonderful colleagues and friends. You know, this is still a work in progress, but I hope I can see all of you again very soon when I come back for my book signing in the near future. So in the next 20 or so minutes, I'm going to give you a brief overview of my project. So here are some numbers many of you probably are familiar with. As you can see, we are living in a century of urbanization, and most of the urban population increase will take place in the global south. And when we are calculating different numbers about urbanization, celebrating the rise of cities, there is also a different voice. I remember when I was doing field work in São Paulo, I talked to a cardiologist. He's my friend's father. So this gentleman, after hearing about my work, he asked me, what is so good about becoming urban? I guess there are many different ways of answering this question, and I'm going to leave this for you. Maybe we can talk about it during the discussion. But I think this is a reasonable question from someone living in this urban center of São Paulo, chaotic urban environment of over 20 million people. And indeed, rapid urbanization in the global south sometimes is associated with transgression, disorder, and informality. So here are some numbers to show you that the urban world is becoming increasingly informal. And so one of the most important and common characteristics of urbanization in the developing world is the rapid expansion of informal housing outside of governmental control or regulation. And according to UN Habitat, about 1/3 of the world's urban population lives in slums. And here, of course, I use quotation marks because I find it's a problematic, is a problematic term, and we can talk about that later. And so this is a photo of Mumbai I took during my field work there the past winter. You can see the highway is dividing the formal city and the informal city. This is a photo I took in Rio de Janeiro. You can see the favelas are invading the mountains. And another interesting thing is UNESCO recently designated a big part of Rio as World Heritage. So this World Heritage actually includes the mountains, the oceans, and also the favelas as part of this designation. So the question is, informal settlements becomes heritage. So what are we going to do with them? So here the question is not only that informal housing is a policy issue, it also presents lots of challenges for how we understand what a city is. And here are the questions I'm trying to address in my project. And as you can see, as a political scientist, I'm actually using informal housing as a mirror to reflect some bigger political questions, including state-society relations, the nature and the mechanisms of governance. And also here, the broader question is, how are ungoverned territories governed? This is a critical issue not only for informal housing, but also for different types of urban space, including border cities, refugee camps, or places under armed conflicts and terrorism. There's a rich literature on urban informality, as some of you know. I'm not going to go into details of the literature, but I want to point out 3 major problems in the literature. First of all, most studies consider that informal housing is equal to slums, but largely ignore the diversity within informal sector. And second problem is that issues like politics and governance are largely missing in the discussion. And thirdly, most studies would focus on single cities or single countries, but we need to develop a more global perspective for better understanding and addressing this issue. Okay, so after criticizing everyone in this field, this is kind of my own argument. So based on my comparative study of informal settlements in 6 megacities of China, India, and Brazil, I'm trying to argue that the informal sector is highly diverse. And actually, a more meaningful divide is less the differentiation between the formal and the informal, but more the differentiation within the informal sector. And secondly, if we want to better understand and address the issue of informality, we need to take a new look at the role of the state. I argue that we often consider state as the regulator of informal activities, but in reality, it plays a really important role in creating and institutionalizing informal activities. And thirdly, urban governance structure is a key for understanding different outcomes of state intervention. I operationalize urban governance structure into 3 major variables: intergovernmental relations, party engine, and non-state networks. I'm going to talk about that in more detail when I show you the comparison among the 3 countries. Okay, so here are my cases. I'm looking at informal settlements in China, India, and Brazil. So as you can see from the figure, the 3 countries are the largest, 3 of the largest emerging economies. And they have all gone through rapid urbanization alongside the growth in past decades. And also one similarity is informal housing is a major issue in all 3 countries. So about 30% of urban population lives in informal settlements in all 3 countries. But in those countries, we see very different approaches of urban policies. And in each country, I'm looking at 2 megacities. And in each city, I'm looking at one type of informal settlement. Okay, so here is like the drier part, of a political scientist type of presentation. So please bear with me. And I promise you, after this, we'll have like many pictures. So just to briefly go over the comparison. In terms of intergovernmental relations, there are some really interesting findings. Although China is a centralized unitary state, Chinese mayors have the biggest autonomy compared to Indian mayors or to Brazilian mayors. In terms of party engine, and as you know, China is a one-party state. So at each level of the government, there is a party committee, and all the big city mayors have important positions in the party. So in other words, the party influence the direction of urban policy. You don't see that in India or Brazil. Both countries have multi-party systems. There are about 40 parties in Brazil, about 90 registered parties in India. And parties are mainly tools for election in those two countries. However, it's very important for mayors to be in the same party coalition as a state governor or president in order to have enough resources and political support. Okay, in terms of non-state networks, there's no democracy in China, but there's limited participation through residential committee or village committee. These are self-governing bodies elected by people in certain areas, and many people on the committees are not only party members, but also retired officials. So lots of studies argue that those committees are both the objects and the subjects of state regulation. And Indian cities are formally democratic, but there are very few formal channels for citizen participation. And clientelism is one of the major phenomena through which people living in informal communities interact with officials. And in terms of Brazil is one of the pioneers in terms of urban innovation. So there are lots of interesting, very progressive approaches of public participation. One of them is called sector councils. So basically, the councils are in different issue areas. And half of the people on the councils are from the government, and half of them are from civil society. And so those councils can be considered as the bridge between the state and the society. Okay, very quickly about the outcomes. Chinese cities really show a pattern of growth machine driven by the state. Policies can be implemented pretty efficiently, but social inclusion is a huge issue. And Indian cities are highly polarized. Both citizenship and service provision are differentiated. And Brazil cities, I call it pluralist in the sense that different interests, different voices, they can have this channel to engage with one another and negotiate. You know, even now, when Brazil is having a politically challenging moment, we can still see the strength of civil society, because right now, the investigation on corruption scandal in Brazil is largely pushed forward by the civil society. And in cities, there is a pro-growth regime, but business interests do not dominate everything. But still, the downside is we sometimes see stagnation because of the negotiation between different interests. Okay, so in the rest of this talk, I'm going to show you 3 cases. So one city in each country to give you some flavor of my work. Urban villages in Guangzhou. I don't know how many of you have heard of this term, but some of my colleagues told me urban village is like a very paradoxical term. And indeed, these are the villages encircled by urban expansion. And the agricultural land is taken over by the government for redevelopment, but the villages are reserved. In order for the villagers to make a living, they often build multi-story houses on top of their own house and rent them to migrant workers. And recently, the city government of Guangzhou started to redevelop those urban villages. So this is a village after redevelopment, okay? It's China style. And so basically, you can see the density is really high. And the reason is the government wants to provide as many compensation units as possible to the villagers, so they are willing to move out. However, there is almost no compensation to migrant tenants. The only thing they can do is to move from one urban village to another. And if you see clearly on this photo, there is a little, like a little gate, yellow head gate in front of this huge condominium. That's the way kind of to show like the traditional style of the community. Yeah, it's very symbolic, I know. Okay, so squatter settlements in Mumbai. So as some of you know, some of you are experts sitting in this room studying this issue. So basically, people would invade public or private land and build their houses there. So they don't have any legal land tenure. About 60% of people living in Mumbai are in these kind of settlements. So actually, some of them are even lower middle class or middle class. So that comes to another point I want to make. That is, informality is not only the weapon of the poor. It's a serious social political issue. And this kind of prevalence of informal settlements in Mumbai is largely caused by a series policy failures, including some rent control policy, which largely destroyed the rental market. And over the years, informal settlements like squatter settlements became vote banks. So politicians would offer them some basic services and to get people's votes in exchange. But you see, this kind of arrangement does not stop the expansion of slums, but actually encourages or stabilizes the existence of the squatter settlements. And there is the recent effort to redevelop the slums, and is highly market-driven. So basically, it starts from the negotiation between developers and local communities. If the developer gets the consent of 70% of people living in this informal community, then he can go to the state agency and buy the land at a very low price. After he buys the land, the pattern is he will demolish the slum housing and build a rehabilitation building for everyone living in a slum on the same piece of land. And then he can use the rest of the land for redevelopment. And maybe you are curious why he has to offer people housing on the same piece of land. Because politicians don't want to lose their votes. Okay, and many of the some of the most expensive housing real estate development in Mumbai are built in this fashion on slum land. For instance, Imperial Towers, they are the tallest buildings, one of the most expensive real estate projects in Mumbai. And on the photo on the top, the two maybe you cannot see very clearly, but two white identical buildings are the Imperial Towers. And the darker lower building is a rehabilitation unit for slum dwellers. And the other two photos shows you the interior of a standard rehabilitation unit and a 4,000 square feet cell unit in Imperial Towers. And recently I was contacted by a wealth management company in Boston. So they asked me something about slum redevelopment in Mumbai because they saw my article I wrote about this project. And they told me because they were reached out by some real estate fund in India. So they want to have some investor from the US to help them with this project in order to push forward, the slum redevelopment in Mumbai. So in other words, this project also becomes international. Okay, finally, let's come to São Paulo. This is one of my favorite cities in the world, although it's very chaotic, but it's very vibrant. So the city center of São Paulo, that's where housing movements take place. About 70% of jobs in the city concentrates in the city center, but many people working in the city center cannot afford a place to live. So what they do is they launched this movement to occupy empty buildings in the city center. And as you can see from the numbers, it's a very vibrant movement. It's also very well organized, and it has a very strong, disciplined, self-governing system. In order to live in those buildings, you have to submit an application. If you are admitted, you'll get an ID card. So each time when you enter the building, you show your ID card, and people living in those buildings take turns to serve as doorman. And every household submits a small amount of money every month. So the money is used by the community organization to buy people food, serve in the public kitchen, and to buy books in the library or build things in the kindergarten. When I was there, I thought, gee, we don't have communism anymore in China, but we have communism now in São Paulo. And also, these movements have a wide social support. One official I interviewed, working in the Department of Urban Planning, told me she donates money to this organization every month for almost 10 years. If an owner realizes his property is taken over, is occupied, he usually would go to court. But remember I told you the housing council. So many of the movement leaders are part of the housing council. So they can use this institution to negotiate with politicians, to negotiate with the court, to postpone eviction. At the same time, they can use lots of progressive legal tools to fight for their rights. One of them I want to quickly mention is called adverse possession, recognized in the city statute. So basically, if you if the occupier occupies the buildings for 5 years, and in this 5-year period, the owner didn't take any legal action, then he can claim the legal rights over the property. So there were lots of, dramatic stories, like the photo on the left. It's called Mawa in the city center of São Paulo. So it has been occupied for a long time, but the owner showed up 4 days before the 5-year mark, went to the court. Okay, so it runs into, lengthy negotiation, stagnation, and eventually the city decided to buy this building and turn it into social housing. And the photo on the right, 2 movement leaders are really proudly showing me their flags. And you can see there's the British national flag on the wall. It was given to them by some British scholars. When I was visiting different occupations in São Paulo, I noticed that there are quite a few number of international students, especially students from Europe, architecture students, urban planning. They are living there, because they told me it represents a new form of urbanism, a new way of creating affordable space outside of governmental control. And actually, the movement leaders, they also offered me to live there with them. And I thought about that, but eventually I have to decline the offer because there was no Wi-Fi in the building. I couldn't do my work. Next time if I go, I think I'm going to think about it. Okay, so very quickly, some implications. For theory, I think we need to make the distinction between state capacity and state intentionality, because we often consider some problems are caused because the state is not able to do something, but actually they are the rational choice of the state actor. Secondly, different participation mechanisms in the 3 countries demonstrate there's a blurred boundary between state and society. So we see the liquidity of governance in the 21st century urban arena. And thirdly, yes, we're in the age of globalization, new liberalism, but we need to really pay close attention to the really divergent local political dynamics. And for policy, there are many implications. I'm sure some of my colleagues, commentators here, can offer even better arguments than I do. But very quickly, 2 things. One thing is, informal housing by nature is part of the housing issue. However, it's linked to a variety of policy issues. Just like public housing projects in US cities in the 50s and the 60s, we know it's not only a housing issue. It's related to the racial conflicts in this country, social economic inequality. So same for informal housing nowadays. We need to integrate it into the broader urban policy agenda. And finally, I think at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves this question. We are using these formal and informal glasses, but is informality the new normal in emerging cities? If so, how should urban policy reflect this notion? I'm going to leave it here and looking forward to comments and questions from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the reasons why your work is always so impressive is the amount of field work that went into those 20 minutes, and yet you sustain a very
I tried. It was really hard.
Argument all the way through. Richard, I'm going to start at your end of the table, and maybe we should begin where Yue began with some of the theoretical implications of her work. In particular, what are the implications for how we think about urban governance of the ways her work demonstrates that the informal and formal are completely intertwined with one another and not really separated at all? How does that, what are the theoretical challenges that raises to the existing literature?
Okay. Well, first I want to say that I think this is one of the most ambitious studies of cities, particularly the politics of cities, that I've ever seen. She's covered 3 major countries, all speaking different languages. She has interviewed an enormous number of people with amazing ability to find people to interview and to get information which people ordinarily wouldn't be able to very easily get. And she's comparing 2 cities in each of those countries, which are very, very large in every case. So before I even answer the question, I want to say that I was virtually staggered when I realized that a person like Yue was able to do this. And as I thought back about the kinds of studies we've been doing, we as academics anyway, without the benefit of, huge project funding, as academics, we've normally done single case studies of cities. Sometimes over a long period of time, we've become masters of a single place, but we have rarely done as much comparative work as Yue has even done in single countries. So she's extended our reach and the breadth of our knowledge and the questions which we now can, I think, ask in a much more nuanced fashion than was ever the case before. And I say this because I've been studying urban politics for a long time in developing countries and in my own country as well. And even in a country like Canada, which, of course, is physically big, but not many people live in it, and not even as many as most Indian states, I would say. And yet, until about 5 years ago, we never even compared cities in Canada when we studied their politics. So what Yue is doing is really almost revolutionary at least in the field that I know. And to get to the question that Blair has asked about governance, Yue is trying to connect the mostly urban planning literature, most of the what we read about cities, and particularly quote unquote slums or squatter areas or whatever they may be called in developing countries, is the province of, well, let's say planners, sociologists, or geographers. Political scientists who introduce the idea of governance, which somehow brings into play the relationship between government and whatever happens in the society at large. That's a very important relationship, but it's very difficult to understand it in so many different cases because it's extremely contextual. But if you don't understand that, then you don't understand anything, because if slums were just to be studied on their own, or if these single physical areas were to be studied just as units of analysis, we would lose so much of the quality of life and the importance of so many linking policies, which Yue has talked about. So I think I really want to just conclude by saying that this takes us in a lot of new directions. It may not answer all of the questions we have, but it is setting a new standard for us to talk about the way in which these low-income, often irregular housing areas connect to the rest of the city and how they compare with each other, both across cities and from one culture and from one country to another. This is very ambitious and very exciting work.
Thank you. Adam, I want to pick up on a political science theme, but it also, I know, relates to your work on India. Hearing words community participation within the context in which communities are very much linked into political patronage networks kind of raises questions about what the meaning of participation really is. And I know these are issues that you've explored in your own work, and I'm wondering if you could add a little bit to our conversation about the meaning of participation based on your research in India and what you see in Yue's work.
Definitely, and I think, excuse me, community participation, I think, is an absolutely key sort of component of development policies in these informal urban spaces. The last few national programs in India focused on urban development, so JNNURM in the mid-2000s, Rajiv Awas Yojana, and now under the Modi government's Amrut. There's been an increasing emphasis on community-driven development, having communities themselves deciding what projects to see forth in their communities, increasing local participation. When you go on the ground, though, I think a lot of this has been on paper, and the projects themselves have not had a great deal of participation within them. And I think communities And India, of course, and other developing countries are incredibly diverse places, and this brings up a lot of sort of classic debates surrounding the pros and cons of decentralization and participation, with the cons, of course, being things like elite capture and inequalities in terms of, in India, caste or religion or gender. Another interesting component that I've seen within the Indian context is a circumvention of local informal leadership. I think one of the important points that Yue brings up in her work is that within these informal urban spaces, there is governance going on. That even in the absence of perhaps direct state intervention, these communities themselves build local leadership from the bottom up to deal in these patron-client relationships. Yue used the word vote bank, and this is actually the politicians in urban India use the English term vote bank to describe their relationship with these communities. And they're loath to break this sort of dependency relationship that the urban poor are really the kingmakers in cities. But within a lot of these communities, they've developed these informal forms of leadership that I think are quite pro-social in nature and are an important part of the story of development in these communities. And I think it's going to be an important sort of component of this community-driven development initiatives in India and elsewhere to sort of take these local informal institutions within the communities seriously.
Victor, I know you've worked in all three countries, so from the point of view of thinking about Yue's work and the challenges of building state capacity in all three countries based on your own experience, how would you relate to what she's saying? How would you add or
Thank you very much. No, thanks to you for inviting me. It's a great contribution. Well, let me just start a little bit by a reflection on some of the work that the World Bank has done, because there has been a lot of cross-country work on informality, at least on the slum upgrading. Arish Dastur is here. He's one of the co-authors of the slum upgrading source book that was prepared about 10 years ago with Barjor Mehta and a few other colleagues, including with a case study from the late Roberto Chavez, who worked in Mauritania. So there is a rich body of literature, practical literature, maybe not academic, on cross-country. So I would encourage you to look at those case studies. And this is the luxury of having multimedia, so you can actually see the stakeholders and people discussing them. So that would be one reflection. The other one, I think it's...
use the mic.
The other consideration is that two dimensions that I think are very important. One is that the reality of informality linked to incrementalism. You know, the poor can't have solutions quickly because they don't have assets. They have no access to credit. So where does that take the city with a need for an incremental growth, not only of the housing, but also of incremental growth of the city? And that, I think, takes one to the issue of how urban policy should accommodate this. And I wouldn't call it necessarily informality, but I would call it this incrementalism. And there, I think that it's very, it's mind-boggling to consider that we are told ahead of time that in the next 20 years there will be so many hundreds of millions of people living in slums, additional, and we take it as a fact rather than a challenge. And I think the urban policy needs to be one that addresses how to make this incremental, the incremental housing and the incremental growth of cities better than what it is now. If you come back to the cases, China's solution is not good, as we can see, and probably not sustainable. India's solution is not good. It's sort of it's a chronic one. And then we see the interesting and instantaneous solution that we have in Sao Paulo, the poor taking over the buildings, which is kind of ironic, being in the Wilson Center to talk about these types of things, right? But it is that diversity of sort of incrementalism versus the need to sort of take over the way things are. I think the last consideration I'd make and reflection is that the impact that this incrementalism has upon the viability of cities to be sustainable from a spatial point of view. Not just, so in aggregate, all these solutions and all this politics is leading to cities that are growing in ways that are either crazy rapid expansion through perverse incentives to expand quickly, or cities that are blocking natural corridors of growth, and is creating unviable cities for the future. So I think, wrapping it up, I think that to me one of the most important aspects of this work would be to take the micro housing and to say, what does that mean in aggregate for the growth and viability of cities? That, I think, is what worries us most. You know, and whether or not those solutions at the individual level are going to be transformative enough to make cities viable in the future. I think under the current pattern, the answer is no. And so it's worrisome.
Michael, I want to turn a little bit to the IDB, because the IDB has been very active in housing projects and has engaged in some of these processes. And when you hear Yue and you read her work, what questions does it raise in your mind about policies?
Thank you, Blair, and congratulations to your work. I think in terms of the questions in the IDB, a large part of our work is actually capacity building of the local teams that implement these projects. So on the ground, what does it mean to turn an area that's informal into formal? And as Yue pointed out, it's not like a light switch goes off and one day you're informal, one day you're formal. There's at least 80 different steps in Brazil to become formal. And it's challenging for a civil service officer who's focused all their life on one particular component, be it housing or delivering mail to a community or sewerage, to actually do something that's integrated. And the flavor of the month of the IDB is integrated urban development. And a few places in Brazil have been able to do this. And a lot of their ability stems from training civil servants, creating units that are the executing agencies of these programs, and actually having civil servants that stay through multiple administrations. The mayors come and go, but having someone who knows how to do neighborhood upgrading over 3 or 4 administrations is key. And I would think the other issue, and this gets back to Yue's focus on intergovernmental relationships and her ability to scale jump, which is something that was mentioned before. I think it's critical to have a national agency or federal agency that provides support to a city to develop that capacity for neighborhood upgrading. A lot of the programs the IDB has supported since the mid-'80s on neighborhood upgrading have been national programs. Over half the $7 billion we've invested have been in national programs. And there's pros and cons of what level you want to focus on. But in our experience, those national programs have been a little more sustainable than some of the local programs. And I guess the last thing I would mention, it's almost a disclaimer to the work on neighborhood upgrading, and that's the importance of a twin-track approach to focus on urban upgrading, but also focus on developing new housing units, oftentimes in different areas of the city. Because urban upgrading doesn't have the capacity to respond adequately to the demand of housing.
I want to pick up on that last theme about developing new units and how people with custodianship for cities and communities can begin to think about putting some of the pieces together. As we've been talking about, as Victor in particular was talking about incrementalism, I kept thinking of Cities Alliance promotion of the idea plan for people before they arrive, which of course is a very good goal, and there are successful examples of that, as they will point out. And yet, the reality behind all those huge numbers of people moving to cities is incremental development, often unshaped by, it's shaped by forces, but not necessarily the formal state, by formality. And I think, Victor, your warning about creating unsustainable communities is really the challenge that we need to begin to be focusing on. So, Yue, let me ask you, based on your work, how do you see the pieces fitting together between what you've been researching in specific communities that already exist and the creation of new urban areas that are connected? They're part of the same broader metropolitan area. And how can this happen? We have a lot of bad examples we can draw on, you know, state-built housing out on the periphery that is inaccessible to any job. So we have plenty of negative examples, but how do you see your communities relate to this broader formal community, and then maybe others can join in too?
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Blair. I think that's a great question. And specifically, I like what both Michael and Victor point out in their comments, that we need to pay attention to not only the maintaining and upgrading of the existing units, but also the construction of new units. And I think that indeed is a challenge. And in different countries, like in Brazil, for instance, there is this national program, Minha Casa Minha Vida, My House, My Life, is launched by the federal government to build affordable housing for people in different parts of the country. But this project has so many problems. And also in countries like China, the government is keep building social housing, but also suffer from many problems, including some of the problems mentioned by Blair. The new units are so far away from the city center, and people lost their social connection. And especially for people living in the informal communities, they couldn't take over their old jobs if they moved to the new communities. So I guess my reaction to this question in terms of the relations between the old and the new, I think it's really important still to think about the construction of new housing units into the broader urban policy agenda. Maybe link the construction of a new unit into the creation of jobs in cities, into the improvement of education systems, and into the construction of different facilities like hospitals, daycare centers, or shopping areas for the inhabitants. So I think only by doing so, we are able to create new and sustainable new units for people living in the city.
Adam, when you think about your research in India, and you hear this conversation about the relation between the formal and informal, as I was thinking back to the image that we had the new towers being built in the middle of informal communities. How big a challenge is it to tie the two sectors together in a way that makes a city more sustainable?
Well, I think as Yue mentions in some of her writing and in her presentation, the linkage and sort of symbiotic relationship between the two are really, really apparent and really not limited just to informal slum settlements. It's something I think it's very important that you bring out in your work, that in a lot of Indian cities, unauthorized middle-class colonies, apartment buildings that stray from sort of the regulatory framework in which they're supposed to be constructed, and other sort of commercial and residential areas that stray from the town plans that are constructed for cities, really opens, at least my eyes, to the absolute pervasiveness of informality that sort of moved beyond even the picture that Yue showed between these middle-class colonies and informal settlements. I mean, it gets at a word that I think really encapsulates urbanization in India that some scholars have used, which is a Hindi term called jugaad, which means sort of spontaneous or improvisational. That you have sort of this expansion of the urban space that is largely unplanned and is not sort of preempting new migrants sort of coming in. I think one of the populations that are moving into cities that are sort of most in need for some degree of thought with future planning are not actually the urban poor, those that are settled there permanently, but a sort of massive chunk of India's population that's circular migrants and seasonal migrants that come into cities during non-agricultural times and work as casual laborers and then return to the village. I think this is the most underserved sort of population. Oftentimes they're absorbed within urban slum settlements and contribute to the growth of them. But I think in terms of planning, even beyond the slum settlements themselves, it's this very fluid, sort of floating population in India that I think is in much need of thought.
Victor, I want to pick up on this theme of the improvisational city, and one could argue that cities have always, to some extent, been improvisational. And while we certainly are aware of planned cities, we're in the middle of one. A city like London certainly was improvisational in many ways. So what is the nature of the challenge now that is different from the challenge in the past?
You know, I think that the improvisational, but I think also with a bit of with a historical perspective and a decision about making things better. For example, London was rebuilt after it burned. How was it rebuilt? And how do you compare that to the rebuilding, say, of Manila after a typhoon? Radically different. I participated in the post-disaster needs assessment there, and it was very disheartening to see that they were not building back better. They were building back slums. So it's that opportunity to make. There are historical opportunities to make things better, and they're not taken. I think there's also, what is different, I think there's also maybe the traditional and I think we need to sort of really make a very big recognition that urban is not Western planning, there's a lot of literature in Spanish and in other languages that is rich with new ways of doing things. But there is a sort of a speed limit to the traditional planning techniques that are data intensive, that require a lot of participation, and when you're going very fast, 5-6% a year, those techniques simply don't hold up. So we need to have new techniques of rapid expansion, and those I don't think are there now. So I think that, to me, that's the challenge. How do you reinvent the new ways of rapid urbanization, building institutions, building capacity? I think Cities Alliance did very good work with some distance learning courses in Brazil with the University of Sao Paulo, recognizing that there was a need to actually teach how to manage that rapid urban expansion. And informality is not necessarily a binding constraint for doing things right. I think that the lack of the intentionality of government, of my father's generation and of my generation, has been one of total failure. Sadly. And we're leaving behind a contingent liability for those that are coming that is incredibly massive, of cities that will require 10 times more, or 5 or 10 times more investment than if we had done it right. This is absurd. So at some point, that line of thinking needs to stop and say, let's stop it. Let's do things better. Because the contingent liability for the future generations is just, or they're not going to like us. They will not look fondly upon us, I don't think.
Richard, as you think about your own research, and I know you're very well informed about the state of literature on urban politics, as you listen to this conversation and the pessimism in this conversation, what is it that the study of urban politics has not gotten right, and maybe what has it gotten right from your point of view?
Okay. Well, first of all, there isn't very much study of comparative urban politics. We, even in the American literature, which is very powerful, at least in my discipline, most of it is about single city case studies or a few American cities compared with each other. And very little work really goes beyond the boundaries of North America, but some of it does. And most of the studies of developing countries are single city case studies. But so we really need to be able to compare cities more. But as we compare them, we realize, number one, we don't really have very good comparative data, just that we can measure accurately between one place and another. And when we see that comparative data, and we tried to bring some of it together in this UN Habitat document, which is now going to be the kind of one of the base documents for the UN Habitat Conference, we tried to see how we could measure these things over the past 20 years. And one of the key problems, which actually is connected to what Victor said, is that many cities in developing countries, even though they are very poor, they are spending even less than proportionally to the wealth of the population than we are in developing countries. I mean, they need so much infrastructure, they need so much investment, both in human assets and in physical structures, but they aren't putting the money into it. They are not putting the resources into their cities, and the worst of all is India. If you look at the measurements of how much Indian cities actually invest, it's very, very small. And so somehow people are not getting this message that Victor is mentioning. And we need to develop infrastructure and services, which is, the very lifeblood of these cities, for whatever reasons, whether they're political, whether they're cultural, I don't know, simply the need to do that simply has not caught up with the challenges. These cities are growing 4 or 5% a year, and our cities in North America are growing maybe 1% a year, to be generous. We can barely keep up with infrastructure, the infrastructure gap in North America, in both Canada and the US. And those cities are putting so much less of their own resources into the cities and hoping it's somehow going to work out. So this is what frustrates me, actually. I just think they have to get the message, and they're not getting it. And that's why future generations are going to be disappointed, I believe. Is that a political question? It is partly. People have to be, there has to be political determination to get people to divert resources into their cities. Is it economic? Or the richer countries seem to do better, a lot better than the poorer countries. But they simply have not quite crossed the cultural gap between thinking that cities are just ephemeral or some kind of a cultural expression of a way of life which isn't really authentic in their societies, to a world in which almost half of the population in most of those countries are living in cities. They just haven't quite got there. So that, to me, is really the essential political question.
Adam, you look like you wanted to jump in.
No, I mean, I completely agree with what Richard just said, and even to stress within the context of India, the sort of dramatic variation that exists in political decentralization and fiscal devolution to cities. Very rightfully so, Yue and most scholars have focused on sort of the large megacities, Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata. And in addition to that, though, most people living in slum settlements in India do not live in the megacities. They live in these sort of tier 2 cities and smaller towns that are spread throughout the country, that are essentially completely neglected, both in terms of scholarly research and in terms of policy. These large national urban development initiatives in India really neglect these cities. I was just in one a few days ago. I got back from India last night. And these, these cities, especially compared to places like Delhi and Mumbai, much weaker fiscal and state capacity, marginal industrial activities, essentially no NGO presence or media attention, and little international investment. Since the early 1990s, India decentralized power through the 74th Constitutional Amendment to municipalities. But it's, I think, these smaller cities and towns that have really sort of fallen off the radar. That I think there's both great opportunity for sort of planning for the future. The town that I was in a few days ago has only about 30,000 people, but it's rapidly expanding, about 10%, adding 10% of its population per year because of a boom in the mining sector in Rajasthan. But when I met with the mayor and the municipal councilors, the lion's share of their sort of resources sort of come from the state and center that are earmarked for particular things. There's no own source revenue or tax collection beyond sort of the occasional taxation of illegal street vendors. And I think 30% of India's urbanization between 2001 and 2011 took place in towns under 100,000 people. So I think these are the areas that I think have a lot of promise, because now we can sort of intervene as policymakers and scholars. But I think that the current state of sort of state capacity and fiscal capacity in these areas are quite wanting.
Michael, in terms of our collectively not getting it right, Habitat 3 is coming up. Habitat 3 is, the world is going to stop for a few days, in theory, and take a look at these issues. It's a huge opportunity to recalibrate our thinking about cities. To what extent is Habitat 3 going to be noticed?
Just as a side note, I've been involved in the Habitat 3 preparatory meetings for the past year, mainly in Latin America. I think one of the large debates there, of course, is housing. And housing was very prominent in the Habitat 2 agenda, but it often stressed that private sector should take a more active role in building affordable housing, which in most countries didn't happen for a variety of different reasons, and I'm sure Victor can elaborate on this issue also. So the whole process now of Habitat 3, I think it's probably the most inclusive UN meeting I've ever seen. They adopted a lot of inclusivity from the Sustainable Development Goals structure. So they are involving different sectors, grassroots organizations, civil society, academia, women's groups, the private sector. So it's producing a lot more ideas. Of course, the danger is that because it's so inclusive, the document now was supposed to be 30 pages, and now it's about 80. So they're trying to cut back the document to a smaller size. But I think if anything, it is going to recognize that there was an urban-specific goal for the Sustainable Development Goals. That's goal number 11. It's going to elevate urban, I think, within the international development discourse. I think a lot of the delegations won't be comprised necessarily of housing ministers, but of representatives from state departments, international development agencies. So I'm hoping that urban will be prioritized. I think it is an important step in the right direction, and I think during the past 10 years there have been the creation of several new housing ministries, which weren't around in Habitat 2. So again, I think it's a great opportunity. I think that the housing issue, since Habitat 2 hasn't been resolved, and not to say something negative yet again, but today there's 130 million more people living in slums than in Habitat 2. So I think it is a reality check. Hopefully where it will lead, and I'll end here, is better monitoring. I think this is something that the Habitat 2 agenda didn't do well, was actually holding nation states accountable for commitment to housing goals.
I'm going to open it up in a second, but I want to do one last round of the panel and then ask Yue if she wants to ask the panelists any questions, and then we'll open it up. But the final conclusion of the presentation was that we're talking about a new normal. And I'm wondering to what extent each of the panelists believe that this is correct, that we're talking about a new norm for the 21st century city. And when we talk about cities, we need to incorporate this interpenetration of formal and the informal into our understanding of what we mean when we talk about cities. And that might be easier for sociologists, but it would also include planners, it would also include political scientists, everybody. So I wonder if we have anyone who would like to offer any observations about that final observation she made. Victor?
Yeah, sure. No, I think it has been it's an old normal. I think it's not a new normal. I think it's an old normal, and it's been there for a while. How the new normal, the new desirable normal would be how you are able to manage it in a productive way, where you're not leaving a contingent liability for future generations, while improving the present generation, if you will. So how are you, and what will it take? But I think that the critical aspect is the speed of the speed that we now have, and how that manifests itself into the type of city. My father, he's an architect he worked in Mexico for many years. They decided to, the Mexican government in the 50s and 60s decided they had a very big problem, and it was education. And it was our lunar project. It was solved. You know, they did everything that was required to increase the literacy in a very profound way. We need that same decision for cities. We need someone to say, we cannot survive in a planet where our cities are falling apart. I think we don't see that type of gravitas of statespersons that need to articulate that. And I'm very hopeful that in Habitat that will happen. Someone needs to say the world is about to blow up if we don't do something. And because it hasn't blown up in a spectacular way, doesn't mean that it's not blowing up. How many buildings fall every week in Mumbai? They fall, and it's in the news, and that's the new normal. A building falling, that can't be acceptable. So I think that the new normal is one where we don't accept that reality, and then we need to do something about it. I would propose.
Any other comments on the new normal?
I just want to follow up on what he said. A very tall building, I think it was.
And use the microphone, Richard.
I'm sorry. A very tall building in Nairobi recently fell, and it was one mud and brick building, a structure on top of another, and it went up 16 stories. And when it rained, the whole thing fell down. There are quite a lot of these new buildings in Nairobi. They're not controlled at all by planners, and 150 people, I think, were killed when this building collapsed. And basically, we are talking, we're going around in circles, I would say. I also participated in quite a long period of discussions and writing in the Habitat process, and except for some ideas which had to do with connectivity, which we didn't used to. We weren't nearly as connected as we were in the past. Some notions of insecurity, which clearly are much more important in cities now than they were before. Most of the other ideas are pretty well what we already knew, but that we're not doing anything about. Now the question is, politically, why aren't we doing that? And I think it depends on the region. Certainly Latin America is pretty far ahead of Africa. Africa's at the bottom. I would say parts of Asia are further ahead when it comes to political commitment and, sophistication of governance when it comes to housing or any other urban services. But the main thing is that it's happening so quickly that governments just do not have the capacity, and the political systems just do not seem to have the capacity to switch over to a new reality quickly enough. And possibly, it won't solve all the problems, but the Habitat 3 conference will at least shine a light on this process if they are willing to talk about politics, which very often, as you know, they're not.
Yue, before we open it up, do you have any reactions to the panelists?
Yes, I do. I think I want to use my privilege. I want to, first of all, I have a quick response to the discussion about the new normal, especially Victor just challenged me by saying it's not the new normal, it's the old normal. I'd like to say, I'd like to shake hands with him by saying that I think no matter it's old normal or it's new normal, it is normal. So I guess that's the common ground we would like to reach. And I'm saying this not just to be nice. We're not just trying to make friends here. I'm saying this because I think the point is, like lots of scholars actually have argued, what is new is not the informal. What is new is actually the formal. But then the question is, here, I think the real important question is, no matter it's old normal or new normal, why for a long time we don't recognize that as normal? Why we consider it as something abnormal or informal, right? And I guess here, the answer to this question is linked to the role of the state. So comes back to my own argument. I'd like to say, the way how we perceive this housing sector, no matter you call it informal or irregular or unplanned, I think the way we perceive this sector has a lot to do with the role of the state in framing this whole policy issue. So I think maybe that's the thing we need to think about, whether the state is being too arrogant and somehow influenced the way how we frame and implement our policy. And since Blair mentioned, I can, address some of the questions I have, and I do have two questions. And one question is for Michael and Victor in particular, because both of you have done tremendous amount of work, very impressive work in the developing world. And that's actually a very specific question. I noticed that both the World Bank and the IDB have done lots of slum upgrading projects in different countries. And I'm actually always curious how the specific communities are selected. So for instance, one of the most important projects is called Favela Bairro, done by the IDB back to the 90s. And there's lots of discussion in terms of whether the communities that were chosen, by certain criteria, and why some are chosen but some of them are not. So this is out of my own curiosity. So I like to hear the answer from Michael and Victor. And after we address that, I'll ask one more general question.
Sure. Great question about Favela Barrio. We're in the third phase now of Favela Barrio in Rio, so we're still continuing our work there. In terms of how we targeted different favelas, it included an economic analysis that had land values. It also included an analysis of the community organizations. So when we mention how important community participation is, for this program it was actually a prerequisite. If there wasn't a community organization intact, we actually couldn't intervene. So there is an argument that the more peripheral communities in, say, Campo Grande in western Rio weren't as affected as the ones downtown because they were younger favelas that didn't have an active community-based organization. There was also a lot of interventions with creating what was called a POSU, which is a post of social orientation, basically a government office in each one of the communities. And those tended to be in communities that were in Quinta do Caju and other areas that were downtown. But the new model is really aligned with the UPP. So they tend to be located in more violent areas that tend to be lower income. And also the other thing to consider in Rio is that about 20% of the property is what they call propriedade non edificandi, which is non-buildable land. These are areas in swamps, these are areas on mountaintops. So if the government can't legally regularize a favela, then there's no sense in actually intervening. So there's a big chunk of favelas that were taken off the list because A, it was either illegal to regularize them, or B, these were federal properties. And it's almost impossible to transfer federal property to a municipal slum upgrading program. And in Rio, 80% of the public lands are actually owned by the federal government.
I think with the bank, I think I would, we have the same idea, same techniques, but I think I would say on a broader basis that there's a strategic choice that is made to ensure that these projects have a strong demonstration effect. They're not designed to fix the cities. They're not big enough. the liability in the city is so immense that it's impossible. So from the outset, I think they were designed that way. We did not have the benefit or the persistence that the IDB has had, which is, I think, what you need. You need to have 2, 3, 4 projects in a row in order to make a difference. And we're seeing that now, because some of our colleagues are going back to projects that were there 20 years ago, and we are seeing the benefits. You know, the 5-year plan, I'm not sure why we adopted it in the IDB and in the World Bank. It was a strange number. But it's not the right number. It's probably closer to 10 to 20 to understand urban transformation. So I think that ideally we would have had as a criteria having the follow-up, and then the issue of now, I think, with the new imperatives, I think climate change and getting people out of danger areas is probably the most important criteria for the future. The most vulnerable are in the worst places, and they are informal and slums, and I think that is the first criteria of urban planning, health and safety, before equity. You can't have equity if you don't have life. And so that I think is the first criteria.
Okay, great. Okay, and my last question is more general, just to our panel. No matter, based on your practice, or for Adam and Richard, based on your more theory-driven work, I'm very interested in the relations between, democracy, social inclusion, and governance, especially in the context of, unplanned or informal housing settlements. And because, we see in countries like India, we do see this form of democracy, and in countries like Brazil, we do see this innovation of new mechanisms of participation, no matter in planning or in other issue areas. And also in countries like China, we do see this kind of like the rather exclusive way of urban development. But also at the same time, in China, the interesting thing is the government has been providing public service at a pretty good rate. The performance in terms of public goods provision in China has also been pretty good. So actually, it seems like many things are going on here in terms of the relations between social inclusion, service provision, democracy, and the governance. So I wonder how do some of my panelists would respond to this rather fuzzy question.
Richard
Okay.
is a good expert.
Oh, I see, okay. Okay, social inclusion and governance. Well, they're almost the same thing in a way. But I would say in general, looking over the last 20 years, we do have a much wider net in local government systems than we used to. We're including more groups, we're having more participatory structures. They don't have to be structures like participatory budgeting, but more and more groups are involved and more people, partly because of the internet and partly because they have more ability to get information. So I think this is happening very gradually, and one of the things that it's driving is cities are pushing for more autonomy, actually, especially bigger cities. They're saying, we need more autonomy, we need to be able to do more on our own. And partly that's because, they have democratically elected politicians who are quite powerful, which, let's say, 20 years ago wasn't the case. So I think as a general phenomenon, governance is really increasing the connectivity of cities with local problems. It isn't necessarily solving them because that requires money and there are lots of problems, but the numbers, the proportion, this is something that nobody has said so far, the proportion of urban dwellers living in slums has declined. It declines around 10% every couple of years, and it's definitely much lower than it was before. And at the same time, even for people living in slums, many people in those areas move out, and this is what we don't really know very well from the statistics. Over time, a slum in year A and then a year 10 years later may consist of very different people, because a lot of the people who originally lived there were able to get education, employment opportunities, move elsewhere, or even improve their own housing within. So there's a fluidity, there's an improvement. Yes, a lot of people do live in slums. Yes, the numbers are going up. But overall, the governance systems at the local level, partly because of decentralization, but just also partly because people are much more connected to what governments do, I would say it's improving.
Adam, and then we'll open up.
Sure. Yue, this is an incredibly important question. I mean, the impact of democracy on urban informality and development, I think, cuts in a couple different ways. And I really like the distinction that Partha Chatterjee actually makes between political society and civil society, that the poor have political society, mass politics, patronage politics, and protests, while sort of the middle classes and those with property rights and the wealthy have civil society and sort of legal measures for seeing forward their material interests. And so I think this sort of distinction, I think, is really, really important. That said, within contexts like India, the poor often get things through these patronage channels, but it serves to fragment sort of the developmental space of the city, where you have some communities getting things because of a distinct political logic, while others are marginalized and remain sort of just as squalid as they were when they emerged several decades before. So I think it's a suboptimal equilibrium, but clientelism itself can be a vehicle through which a lot of these communities get things.
Thank you. We're now going to open it up. We will get you a microphone and ask that you identify yourself before asking a question or comment. We'll go to this gentleman here and then the gentleman there. We have a couple people over here.
Thank you. My name is Carlos Linares, independent consultant. Congratulations, you. Very interesting and very innovative approach, I think, to look at governance in informal settlements. But my question is mainly directed to Michael. You mentioned the link between new housing and slums. And you, in one of your earlier slides, you talked about the reasons why slums came about and are expanding, increasing. I would like to get your sense of whether you see slums as a consequence of the lack of affordable housing. And by corollary, what is labeled as adequate housing is not affordable to the poor, therefore subsidies are not sufficient to cover the deficit. So there's a link there that Target 11.1 addresses, where they, in the same sentence, talk about adequate and affordable. The concept that governments, in my experience, have of adequate housing is not affordable, therefore you have to apply subsidies, and they are never sufficient. How do you see that link?
Okay, and before you answer, let's take this gentleman's.
I'm Ishrat Hussain at the Asia program here. I live in Karachi, so I can relate much to Mumbai rather than to Sao Paulo or Ganju. Let me suggest an alternate way of thinking about informality, that it is an efficient outcome both from the supply side as well as the demand side. The demand is of the migrants who are coming in from the rural areas to the cities like Bombay or Karachi, who can afford a certain proportion of their income for housing. And therefore, the formal housing is totally out of reach for them, because they have to send the money back to support their families in their villages or in their communities. Therefore, there is a constraint as far as the proportion of the income they can afford. The supply side, on the other hand, you are a great proponent of state. I am a civil servant. I have managed the urban areas. There is a nexus between politicians, the officials, and the private sector to create rents by encroaching upon the state land for which they pay zero rent, and therefore they also get electricity, water through illegal means. And this combination of both the land, which is at zero cost, and the illegal or services which are coming in, creates opportunities for the rent, which is distributed among the corrupt officials, politicians, and the private developers. So the supply side leads to the encroachment of land, of the state land, in the hands of the private sector. So you have an equilibrium where the demand is actually meeting the supply because of the lowering of the cost as compared to the formal sector. The regulatory costs and the formalization cost in Karachi or Mumbai are 150% more than the cost of the informal settlements. Therefore, this is an efficient economic outcome, both from the demand and the supply side.
Why don't we take these two questions? Michael, maybe you answer the first and then Wei the second. And then we're going to come up to this side. We have a couple of questions on this side. But go ahead, Michael.
Great. I was really pleased to see affordability in the new SDGs. And I think it's going to lead to a very interesting debate because the SDGs, as people know here, apply to all countries, unlike the MDGs that applied only to less developed countries. Within the debate about affordability, I think there is an international consensus about even what that means. In the States, I think the rule of thumb is about no more than 30% of your income should be devoted to housing. If you're in a larger city, of course, that can be larger. The debate overall, too, it really gives precedence of owning housing over rental housing, and I think there needs to be more of a space in the debate for rental housing, which I think is a great option for lots of people. And in terms of, what causes informal housing, is it a political situation? Is it economic? Is it a mixture of both? That's tough to disentangle. I think that as a planner, I spent a lot of time reading urban plans and looking at legislation. One of the things I've found is that lots of the urban plans don't give any room for building low-income micro units that are affordable. Oftentimes, the plot sizes are too high for affordable housing. There is a lower number of housing units per hectare. So I think there needs to be work in redesigning urban plans that are more appropriate for people in low-income areas. But that said, too, I think there hasn't been any monitoring of urban plans to begin with. I think for lots of cities, there aren't enough inspectors to actually monitor if plans are working or not. So I think that's something that the international community can really work on. I think what we're not seeing, which maybe I would take a little bit of disagreement from Victor about, is this an old normal, is massive land invasions. I think when I think of the massive land invasions of the 1970s, say in Peru, which were often coincided with political parties and political groups, I don't tend to see that now. I think a lot of it is very incremental, the creation of informal housing over years. I don't see these massive invasions that we had in the 70s and 80s.
Well, what about the point of informality representing coming to an efficiency equilibrium?
Right, that's a good point. And actually, I'm not sure if you are familiar with, but some of you here probably are, the Peruvian economist, Hernando de Soto. And when he wrote about the informal economic sector in Peru back to the 80s and 90s, his argument is very similar to what you made. And his point is that the informal economic sector, like street vendors and all sorts of the informal jobs, actually is an efficient way for people to deal with the situation, because in order to get a license, it's very costing. It's very costly for people, so they go to the informal way. So he calls this as a survival strategy and emphasizes informality can bring efficiency to the economic system. So I can pretty much see, this argument still works in the housing sector in the sense that, like you said, it's very costly for people to have the formal housing, so the informality is a way for them to go. And also it can bring the political economic benefits to the state. However, I think this kind of efficiency or economic focused argument, I think it has a problem, which is it largely neglects the political fragmentation within the state, and also the fragmentation between the state and the societal actors. So why I say that? If we take a look at the efficiency for the state, as you know, the Indian state is very fragmented and complicated. So regarding the slum issue, you have the municipality, the state government, and the federal government. They all have very different interests. So sometimes they are competing with one another in terms of how to deal with the informal housing. So I would say this is probably more complicated than the issue of efficiency. Another thing is, even when the government is carrying out the slum redevelopment, there is also this, struggles between different political and social actors. Like some of the officials I interviewed in charge of the slum redevelopment project in Mumbai, who is the state official, told me nowadays the problem is slum dwellers are ready, but politicians are not ready. So you can see it's not as simple as efficiency. I would like to argue that there's a political fragmentation we need to pay attention to. But yes, I agree the validity of the efficiency argument in terms of why we see the informality.
We had 3 questions on this side. We'll go ahead and take them. And we have 4 questions, so we'll take them in pairs. The gentleman in the white, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to know which are the conclusions concerning informality in the different countries, because you have only one definition of informality, or that definition changes for the different countries, because they are related to the legal framework, of course, of the country. So I would like to know which are your conclusions concerning legality in each country. I would also like to ask you if the problem of corruption is included in the analysis of policies, because we can't deny the fact that's a lot of corruption in many countries. And well, I come from Mexico, and there the problem of things have changed a lot, but corruption is there always, and that has a very bad effects on the possibility of changing the situation for poor people.
Okay, and the gentleman.
Thanks. I'm Fred Krimgold from Virginia Tech, and I refer back to 2 comments from Victor. One is related to the fire of London in 1666, and we might look at other places like Chicago before the Chicago fire in the 1870s, and both of those pre-disaster cities were informal. And one of the characteristics of informal construction is disaster vulnerability, which is what I think Victor also referred to in terms of the priority for safety. And it seems to me that somehow in this discussion of formal versus informal, that formal has been cast as bad and informal as good. And it seems that formal regulation and organized planning has evolved over a long period of time, at least several hundred years, and it has resulted in development and safety and improved health, and seems maybe inappropriate to throw it over.
Okay, why don't we go, Wei, you respond, and maybe Victor and Richard might have something to respond to Fred. Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll go first. Okay. So I'll quickly address the question about corruption. And indeed, corruption is a major issue in developing countries. And maybe my colleague from the Brazil Institute, maybe Paulo, know more about the investigation. And yeah.
How many hours do you have?
Yeah, because we know how the corruption issue in Brazil has led to the whole, like a trigger for the political crisis there, and also in China too. So my reaction is, in the setting of informal housing, corruption is also important, especially at the micro level. Like Michael mentioned the UPP, the police pacification project in Rio. And so that's just a reflection, because this UPP, the police pacification, one function is to deal with drug dealers, is to take over the land from the control of drug dealers. Another function of this program is to deal with the corruption in the police, because the old police is very corrupt, and of course, I don't know about the new one. And but the thing is that there is almost like this symbiotic relations between the police or even the local officials and the drug dealers. So that leads to the whole array of governance issue in the informal settlements in real. And so I think it's critical to solve the issue of corruption in order to have more efficient governance of the informal areas, actually of any urban policy. And the first question you're asking about my conclusion about informality and illegality. I'm not sure what exactly
the
that.
importance of
Yeah.
local conditions and local property rights. Are you really comparing?
Okay.
Are these similar because the property regimes are going to be very different in the three countries?
Right. Yes, that's a very good question. So indeed, it's very different. Like in China, as you know, there's almost no private property rights. If you buy this condo or the house, you own the house, but you don't own the land. And there's also this dual land ownership between rural and urban in China. And then in Brazil, as I showed you the case of São Paulo, there is this dimension of social function of properties. So the constitution requires that property should fulfill social function. So the movement leaders argue that the empty buildings are illegal because they do not fulfill social function. So in other words, they argue we need to introduce a new dimension into property rights. So my point here is, I think the study also shows not only the concept of informality, but also the concept of property rights is contested. So we need to understand in different local contexts.
The defense of the formal, Victor, Richard?
I'll defend the formal. I think it has to be a new formal. That's what we need. We need a new formal. And I think I'll put a plug in for something that the IDB did some years ago, which I thought was brilliant. I mean, the idea of talking about housing, but talking about housing in the context of the city, not the individual, but the city. And Fernando Rojas and others produced this book, Building Cities, which is fantastic. It's a housing book about cities. It's not a housing book about the household. And I think that we need to move beyond the individual to the collective and how we can make cities better, not for one, but for all and for many years to come. And I think that goes to the point of I mean, I agree with the eloquent economic analysis that was made about demand and supply, but can you imagine interviewing someone that's living in a squalor and then they tell you, yeah, I live in the equilibrium. It doesn't look like the equilibrium, it looks like a slum. And it's a miserable place that where people's their life expectancy is lower, child mortality is higher. I mean, the costs of those places are human, and they're beyond a market clearing system. People suffer, generations suffer, and worst of all, what we see in our cities is that they're chronic. They're not temporal. There are some economists that see it as a romantic notion that that labor markets work, and so so let them work, but the housing market doesn't work. But well, we can fix that later. Well, they did it in Korea and Singapore, but we're having a tough time in the rest of the world doing that same sequencing. Maybe too big. Maybe we're not following this right recipe. So I think that it's this the critical sequencing that doesn't sort of work out. And I guess the last point on the idea of the massive invasions, yeah, we're not seeing them perhaps because they're not being allowed in a very ruthless way. And I think the response, I think, to those invasions, I think in some cases has been very productive. The bank, and again, there's the Villa Salvador case for Peru and for Lima that it was a bank project. Again, our friend Roberto was there leading that work, and they did unimaginable things like having very high standards, including subterranean electrical lines, because they saw into the future. They wanted to be part of the organic structure of the city. They didn't want to be the poor part with a lower standard that was not going to connect to the rest of the city. So I think that the informality, and that's where informality and formality needs to come together, is when you have a natural progression of city building, where you have the urban tissue, the texture of the city makes sense. It's no longer, if you look from space, something that is crazy. And if you, in the streets, it's even worse because it's impenetrable places where the rich have to go by and the poor can't even get out. So I think that's what we need, I think, the formal and informal.
Richard, anything to add?
The only thing I would say is that I remember 1972, at 71, no, actually 73, I'm sorry, the first kind of major article about the informal sector was written by Keith Hart, who was an anthropologist who was working in Ghana, and he was trying to understand the activities of a particular group of people who came from the north and were working as laborers and casual workers in the south. And he said, this is the informal sector, and the people who come from the north and work in the south find work this way, and then they can go back when they need to, and they don't have to pay taxes, but on the other hand, it's precarious, and there are risks involved. Having said that it was precarious and there are risks, but at the same time, it's very flexible, we kind of fast forward to the year 2016, and of course, I'm going to make a huge generalization, but I really don't think we've learned a lot more about the informal sector since it was not really discovered, but it was effectively and beautifully described by Keith Hart in 1973. And we talk a lot about it, and it has to do with corruption, it has to do with national culture, it has to do with the ways in which even people in formal systems operate in order to achieve flexibility. So it seems to be everywhere, and at the same time, it's no more a city function, I think, than it's a cultural or national function. So it's important, and we can't really measure, we can't govern effectively when much of the population operates, under the radar or without any control because of governance structures and legislation. But in the poorer countries, it's at a much higher level, and in richer countries, it's at a much lower level. And one of the best solutions to informality is to develop economically, but that's not so easy.
I have 3 people on the list. Well, there are 5 people now on the floor, but we're going to take the 3 people we've asked first. The 2 women on this side and the woman there, and then we'll come up and then try to go to the back. But we're beginning to have a time constraint.
I'll make this really quick. I think that infrastructure always has a gendered aspect that doesn't get talked about enough. I think that the more formal setups have benefits for women and children in protection and services delivery, but I find that the informal allows for more women's voices politically. So I would like to know if Wei found any gender differences in the way that she did her analysis, if there was something that stood out that benefited women or didn't benefit women. And this comes from Michael's comment about the circular population, the circular migratory population, because Cynthia Enlow said many years ago that in beaches, bases, and bimbos, that when you set up huge military encampments, that skews the economy to serve them. So that could be a part of the slum setup.
Patricia?
Patricia Fagan, Georgetown University. I want to really ask some clarifications in the area of social inclusion and governance. And the question, which has evolved over time, like cities in an incremental way, is about what has happened over time. I'm assuming from what I've heard from all of the panelists that in the slums, in the cities that Wei has studied, that there's a stable population, a somewhat stable population. And we're not talking about people maybe I'm wrong, this is just what, actually it's a question. Is there a stable population, or how much mobility is there among the population at any given time? as I see it, there's a stable population, and that stable population grows incrementally from people coming from outside and from reproduction inside. And with relation from the people coming from outside, my question is, are those people largely still rural urban migrants, or are they perhaps also people from other smaller cities, other smaller settlements coming to a different place, or people moving because economic opportunities are changing? Is it the same old classic urban, rural urban migration pattern? And so that's the first part of it. The second part of it is on the internal reproductive part of the growth of the slums. I would think, my guess, that the participation, the larger participation from urban slum dwellers, informal sector dwellers, comes from people who are in the second generation, who are perhaps used to the environment, who know the ropes, and who are getting involved politically with the governance of their own communities. I don't know if that's right or that's wrong. But if it is right, if it is the second or third generation, what is that telling us about the politicization of urban societies and what's that area?
Okay, well, right here.
Shows how people moved out.
Thanks. Sorry, I'll keep this brief. So my name is Maureen Donahue, and I'm from Rutgers University. My question is basically the same question that Yue posed to the panel, but I'd like you to sort of answer it yourself. So you asked about the effect of participation and democracy. So I study Brazilian housing movements and the housing councils, but could you tell us, just looking at your pictures between China and Brazil, you talked about the participation in Brazil, and clearly participation is very different in China. So could you elaborate a little bit about what your conclusions are about what is the effect of participation on outcomes in terms of responsiveness to the people living in the informal settlements or slums, and sort of what their feelings are about the redevelopments in China as well, and kind of what the effect of participation is?
Okay, we'll take these three, and then there's still 3 questions left. Well, you want to take as many as you can, and then we'll
Okay.
see.
I can quickly respond to one question about the gender issue. And indeed, it echoes my observation that in many of the informal communities, you see actually females are playing a really important role because they are considered as the force of stabilizing the communities, of paying, they take care of the children and they want to have more savings. And indeed, I have encountered so many women leaders, especially in India and Brazil during my field work. And another thing is about the pattern. Like, do we still see this kind of classic rural to urban migration pattern in the informal communities? And I would say this is one of the major patterns I have observed, and especially in countries like China. And many people say that there are no slums in China, and I agree. But there are the urban villages, and where almost 70% of people living there are migrant workers from the rural areas. So I think that's still a valid major pattern in those places. And the last question, I'd like to respond to the last question. I consider that when we talk about participation, usually it means we have this forum for people to have their voice heard, like a meeting like this. But my observation is that to have the channel of public participation is different from to having one's interest being represented or being transformed or being transferred into policy. So for instance, if you ask to people living in Paris, although there is also this kind of local council called Conseil du Quartier, neighborhood council, but many people don't participate. And one reason is they feel their interests have already been represented. So I think we need to make the distinction between the form of participation or the form of democracy and the real delivery of the services. And I think China is an interesting case because although the participation level is low, the level of service provision is pretty good. And my hypothesis is that it has a lot to do with how the authoritarian regime tries to establish its legitimacy. So kind of to maintain the legitimacy through public goods provision.
Okay, I think there were three more questions. The two gentlemen in the back, and Paulo. So, right there.
Thank you. My name is Rick Ryback. I'm with Just Economics. My experience is mostly with domestic issues here in the USA, so I'm not very experienced with foreign issues, but I've learned a lot and really enjoyed the conversation today. One of my questions is thinking about these informal settlements, and Mr. Stern's talk about the importance of infrastructure, affordability, corruption, all these things. The thing that comes to my mind is that, at least in the United States, I think we live in a world where no good deed goes unpunished. In other words, if we find a low-income community and we say, oh, we'll improve them by making the schools better, or reducing crime, or improving transportation, if those goods and services are well-designed and well-executed, land values and rents go up, and the people who are the intended beneficiaries get displaced, and we've ended up using public tax dollars to enrich landlords who weren't that poor to begin with. And I'm wondering to what extent, and also the fact that, of course, private individuals can appropriate this publicly created land value, I think becomes not only the fuel for land speculation, which is very parasitic and drives up the cost of housing, but it's also, I think, a source for corruption. So I'm wondering to what extent you see any of this in these other societies that you've studied.
Okay, when we come, the time arrives, maybe Victor, you can answer that question. The gentleman in the back?
Hi. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike McCarthy. I'm a research fellow at American University's Center for Latin American Studies and a consultant to the Latin America program here at the Wilson Center. First, I just want to say it's a really great panel, and I think that if there's one common thread I detected, it's that the urban area is a sort of important and very rich laboratory if you're trying to understand a number of different issues confronting politics more broadly, whether or not we're talking about it through an informal or formal lens. My first question is about the issue of stateness itself. In the presentation, there was a sense of comparing these different cities. I wonder first if you could talk a little bit about how the state is, in fact, establishes some kind of presence in these spaces. And then is that presence, in fact, predicated on the existence of some kind of reliable census data about the populations there? For the multilaterals, my dissertation research looked at community development programs under Chavismo in Venezuela, in Caracas. And it was quite striking that the two of the main findings that you mentioned directly correlate with my conclusions, which is that governments, whether or not, governments or multilaterals are interested in, first of all, demonstration effects. They need that in order to get things going. And second, the rich get richer in terms of the most well-organized are the ones who often get grants. So for the multilaterals, I'm curious, both of you mentioned something about the time horizons of these grant programs. Is there any way in which the development community is thinking about how to get beyond the problem of working with the most well-organized? Since one of the biggest challenges is obviously trying to mobilize the unorganized and get them to be involved in one way or another. I have many other thoughts, but just want to stop there in the interest of time. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Paulo?
Just one observation. When you talk about the UPPs, the units for pacifying police, we actually had two great presentations here in 2012, 13 about people in charge of UPPs, and unfortunately UPPs are mostly a failed experience. Why? Because what should have happened was economic development that would sustain what they were achieving. And actually today the drug traffickers are back at the units, even at the best ones that were the initial ones, Dona Marta and others. And this relates to the other question, listening to all presentations. I'm from São Paulo. I have been here forever, but I go there all the time. And one thing that I sense, and I talk to my friends in Brazil, and I visit the places. I visit the Capão Redondo, and I go to places. Those are no longer cities. Those are encampments for human beings. And so I'm talking about São Paulo as a whole. For one reason, I am a walker. I walk everywhere. And I cannot walk in São Paulo because my relatives tell me, don't do this, it's dangerous. If you cannot walk in your city, it's not a city. And there is a sense of fear where violence happens, which is in these poor communities, and there is a widespread sense of fear in the privileged communities also. So they live in the same space, but they don't share a city. And I believe that obviously this is going to intensify because the economic crisis Brazil is experiencing now is probably the worst ever, and it will take years to confront and to resolve if political leadership is available to do that. So that's why I would like to, I think that we are probably going to have more of informality because of failures, as a consequence of failures in economic policy and in other aspects. So I hate to be, normally I'm very upbeat person, but talking about cities and seeing what's going on in Brazil and overall in the economy, cities will suffer enormously without, I'm not telling you that aren't wonderful local leaders and mobilizations. Yes, they are creative, etc. But the times ahead will be very, very tough, and will test all the concepts that you guys have presented.
Well, a lot on the table. Why don't we just start with Richard, and we'll move down and give Yue the last word, and any observations. I think there are some questions for our representatives of the international development community, but there's a lot on the table. Richard?
Wow, okay. Well, I think people have asked a lot of pretty good questions, and I don't remember hearing an answer to Martha Steingart's question about how to define informality in different cultures, because virtually all of these questions are very contextual. Cities are very large. We're dealing with more than half the population. Just because we call them cities and we have categories for things doesn't mean there are simple ways of describing them. So, we need to have long-term discussions. We need to bring evidence to bear. We need to compare over time. We're beginning to do this a lot more, and not just with census numbers, but with figures for all kinds of other things, for the way in which cities operate, the way they organize transit, the way they dispense land, how many houses they build, what the Gini coefficient is in different cities. Even that number we don't have very accurately for many cities in the world, although it's probably increasing in other words, inequality is increasing for the largest cities. So we're getting more and more of this information, and we are comparing them more, and we're having a more intelligent discussion about cities in a way that we could not possibly have had, 10 or 15 years ago. So I just enjoyed the conversation. The questions, we didn't answer most of them, but Yue has all of these questions to deal with for her book, and I'm sure it's going to be a bestseller.
Yeah, just to respond to one of the questions I'm not sure got answered on the degree to which the populations in informal settlements are fluid. At least speaking with the Indian case, I think there's a great deal of fluidity. Even when a community is evicted and resettled elsewhere, what you often see, and you can see this with satellite imagery, people will move right back to the exact same space. They sell their apartment where they've been resettled, and they come back. There's huge bottlenecks in people moving out of settlements. There's a great article by Anirudh Krishna called Stuck in Slums, where you'll find in a recent survey that myself and a co-author just did, 15% of the people in our sample of 2,000 slum residents had college degrees. You'll find engineers, lawyers. They simply cannot afford sort of formalized regular housing, and so they're sort of stuck in these bottlenecks. So it's interesting to contrast this fluidity with the fact that people aren't moving into these sort of formalized middle-class settlements. And I think it's because it's sort of there's a shifting population within these settlements themselves. And because there's such a great degree of variation in the infrastructure in some of these settlements, some hardly look like slums at all anymore. They're in the census as slums, but when you walk in, the roads are paved, the water is running, there's electricity provision. and others sort of conform to sort of the pictures that you typically see of these settlements. So I think there is some degree of upward mobility within the informal settlements, as Yue was talking about, sort of this differentiation within informality. But you do see a great deal of fluidity within these communities themselves.
Okay, let me focus, as Blair asked me to, on the land value issue. I think I think this is one of the big, the giant issues that we have in our emerging cities, and we need to put a glove on the invisible hand. I mean, it's that simple. It just doesn't work for everybody, right? And especially if it's invisible. Now, how is that? And some decisions need to be made. We're now working on a course. Richard Astur is here in that team, Mancha Chen, on a course on land value capture. And the beginning of that reflection is whose value is it? Who owns the value of increasing value of land because of public infrastructure? And the answer is not the people that own the land. How do you deal with that in a delicate way that is both allows people to invest in land, but also to recognize that the principal way they're going to get rich is not by sitting and waiting for the infrastructure to come, and that is, I think, is a big recognition. Just a quick issue on the slums and the issue of generations. Very interesting work that Janice Perlman did. I think Mila directed that work of someone going 30 years afterwards and looking, and it was a sad sort of outcome. It wasn't an optimistic outcome of they know the ropes and now they're very engaged with it. No, that was not it. It was the pioneer sort of generation was actually more entrepreneurial than the second generation. And just a last comment, I agree completely with your definition of a city. If you can't walk through it, it's not a city. And that's why I meant about the texture of the slums and the formal city joining. And so you really have a seamless city where you can actually walk and you feel safe and the infrastructure is convenient enough for everyone to feel part of it. A lot of that myth is now being broken in our cities with the day of the bicycles, where for the first time you're having poor people driving their bicycles through the rich areas. So it's incredible how that social porosity needs to take place with some innovation. Maybe sometime we'll get off the bicycle and walk. Right now we're in bicycle speed. So thank you.
Michael?
Yeah. I want to respond quickly to the question about is it still rural to urban migration. And I wanted to highlight the World Bank's System of Cities report that came out a few years ago. Since that report, there's been a few countries that actually have city system strategies. So they're developing better models to look at these urban corridors. Another thing that we're seeing is that we're seeing places that were categorized as rural in 1980 or 1990 now simply categorized as urban. And that deals with the issue of what is the urban threshold. For the issue of MDBs and outreach to civil society, the extent to which they can be involved in upgrading programs, I can't speak to all of the IDB group. We are implementing a program in Asunción that I think is an innovation. In this program, the government is supporting Habitat for Humanity to actually train the government in community intervention to develop a neighborhood called La Chacarita. So we're actually contributing to that report, and then we're supporting the government of Medellin, which has had a great experience with upgrading, to come to Asunción and to work with the community on community mediation.
Well, you get the last word.
Okay, great. So my last word is, first of all, I feel very inspired by the comments of all the panelists. I think they offered wonderful insights based on their own research, their own work. And also, I really appreciate all the questions, especially that we see questions from all of you, from your experiences across the world, not only from the developing world, but also some questions related to U.S. cities. I think it indeed shows the importance of this issue. And so the final thing I want to say is, to me, the issue of informal housing is actually the issue of citizenship. So that actually always reminds me of one of my favorite quote about cities from Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Social Contract. He says, houses make a city, houses make a town, but the citizens make a city. So I think for lots of developing country cities and countries, the issue is how do you deal with your fellow citizens who are from the countryside or who are from the poor sector of the society? How do you offer people services, infrastructure, and equal rights? And I think those are the fundamental issues countries like China, India, and Brazil need to deal with. And I guess the last thing is I will try to finish my book as soon as possible. So you all can find it in the bookstore. Thank you so much.
Thank you. When Wei was speaking, she reminded me of something I was told. Several people in this room will remember Pep Suberos. He was a philosopher, novelist in Barcelona. He passed away recently. And Pep was involved in that first post-Franco government and municipal government in Barcelona. And we met in the 1990s. He had been the head of the cultural program for the Barcelona Olympics. He had done lots of things. And I was talking about, why is it that Barcelona succeeded? And he said, well, Blair, we didn't start out to create a great city. We wanted to foster a democracy, and we got a great city as an outcome. And I think there's great insight into the relationship between citizenship and the urban, and thank you for bringing that up.
Indeed. Thank you, Blair.
Thanks.